If you can see me and hear me, then it's all right. You did it quicker than last time. And one day I have to write it down because it's hopeless. Let's see. Normally I can see how many people are there. Oh, there again. Okay. Well, today we have two things we want to do. We start with the usual question and answers. So if you have anything you want to ask, feel free to do so. You can type it in the chat and I'll read the question out loud and then comment on it or try to give an answer, whatever may be applicable. And we'll do that for maximum about 19 minutes, and then I'll do another paper presentation to close things up. So I hope you can hear me, and well, that's at least that's something that you can hear me. So if anybody wants to ask me something, otherwise we'll just do the paper. Let's see if there. I can't see it. Alberto, Dawson, Luis. Okay. It always takes a bit of time to get going, but usually it happens at some point. Thanks, Louise. Yes, well, it's the third time I'm doing it, so I'm still trying to find my way using this technology, but we'll see how it goes. I have to read every comment first. Dawson said these are the trial runs. We aren't at peak performance with live question and answers yet. No. We might want to add some visuals and videos and maybe some music sometimes. So we can see how we can develop it. Louise asked me if I'm wondering about the contributions, the event cycle. Could you talk about that? Well, I think that there are some problems with this whole notion that it is a cycle. I would say it's more of a pathway than a cycle. There's some development going on, of course. The first question would be which of these texts you put into this, what von Herman used to call science-geschichtliche Abhandlungen, or being historical treatises. Between the number 65 to 72, he leaves out some text. The Hegel interpretation, the Koinon is not in it. So I think the main thing where Heidegger starts is with the contributions to philosophy, and there he's trying to develop what he calls ein erdenkendes Denken, a thinking that's more end thinking, this translated. So that is trying to think not in a metaphysical way, stay out of the metaphysical traps, but it's therefore also being historical kind of thinking. So Heidegger thinks still in the contributions against metaphysics. He is developing this other kind of thinking as a non-metaphysical kind of thinking, which leads to a lot of interesting passages and shows light on a lot of the basic problems. But it's also not the answer. I think von Herman likes to pinpoint to a certain text, say, well, this is the real Heidegger. I don't think that's ever the case, even with Being and Time. Although it's, of course, Heidegger's most famous work and most studied. So after the contributions, he starts working on what he calls Besinnung. which is translated as meditation, I think. And that's also basically trying to develop another kind of thinking, and try to think not from Dasein towards being, but from being back towards Dasein, or from being immediately to Dasein and disclose being at the same time as disclosing Dasein, which is of course something that's only possible after you have done the existential analytic of Dasein in being and time. Otherwise, you cannot do it. So, Besinnung, it's interesting that he uses the Besinnung and not the verb besinnen. Normally, it would also be then sich besinnen. But the notion of Besinnung goes back to 1915 in Heidegger. So there's another one. So I'll finish this one first. So it's going after the sense. And if you think of being, then you could say that basically Heidegger keeps true to that in a sense. This whole path of thinking that there is the meaning of being and there's the sense of being. The meaning of being is what metaphysics is developing. But in everything that is, there is an ising happening, and this ising is the let's say the disclosure of being within that which is, and the sense is then trying to find out in which different ways being is, and you find some of these ways in being in time, like Erschlossenheit, being in the world, being in, being with. And it's all different ways in which being discloses itself. So Heidegger doesn't only talk about Befindlichkeit, for example, disposition as it is translated, but also of Mitbefindlichkeit, which refers to the Mit sign, being with. So there's a different kind of Befindlichkeit or disposition in Dasein than just the one he talks about at the beginning. And I think I won't go over all the text, but the one we're working on at the moment is Das Ereignis. You could simply, to put it in simple terms, Das Ereignis is a reattempt to rethink the Ereignis as he had developed it in the Contributions to Philosophy, which has a subtitle, of course, from an owning, or from Ereignis in German. So he dares criticize his own attempt as still being too metaphysical and too much dependent on metaphysical language. So that's basically what I want to say about this. Then there's the next one. When did Heidegger first put forward the historical nature of being in a particular text? I think it's also a thing that happens over time. He first starts interpreting the history of metaphysics or the history of philosophy, and that is going to develop as this series of fundamental metaphysical positions. So in a fundamental metaphysical position, the meaning and sense of being is brought to light, and it's in different ways through the history of philosophy. So that in itself shows all kind of history. These changes are basically inexplainable if being is static and has no movement, has no development, has no history. So that's when the notion of the issue of thinking begins to come up. And he talks about it in lecture course as well. The first attempt to really develop it is Contributions to Philosophy, I think. Because he had been doing some seminars on the fundamental metaphysical positions of Western metaphysics just prior to or at the time he was writing the Contributions. So it's typical Heidegger. I've said it, I don't know if I said it here before, but I often said it the last few days, is that his path of thinking is always a path of passes, or his way of thinking, you better say then. This way of his thinking is always a collection of passes that he's traveling at the same time. And it means that he's always working on at least 3 or 4 different projects. And at some points they come together, most often due to external circumstances. Heidegger is in that sense also an Aristotelian. Like Aristotle, he starts with a question and lets his research be dictated from the thing he's trying to disclose, the phenomenon. And a large part of his thinking, especially before being in time, is trying how to find the right access to phenomena. How can you describe life or human life without turning it into an object and unliving it in that sense? So that's a trait that Heidegger shares with Aristotle. But so external circumstances like with the NATO report of 1922 and being in time in 1926, he had to publish something for the furtherance of his career. And then he had to pull some of these passes together and unify them. And especially with being in time in of course, the NATO report is on a much smaller scale, and in being in time, it's this picking out things that he had worked on and written, results of his research, and trying to fit them into one framework, which brings with it all the inattentions of being in time, I think, and some of the problematics of it. And also the reason why in the end he felt he could not finish the book as he had planned it out at the beginning. So Dawson has another question. At what point did the poet become essential to Heidegger thinking? Was Rilke someone he always admired? I think being at the German gymnasium at the beginning of the 20th century, it meant there was a lot of reading of all German poetry and novelists. So Heidegger already as a schoolboy was reading Hölderlin, was forced in quotation marks to read Goethe and Schiller as the classics of German language. He read Lessing as well. And he also, as soon as it became available, he was reading Tragel in 1914, 15, around that time, when the De Facto in Vienna was published by Ludwig von Vicker, and he introduced in this magazine not only Tragel's poetry, but also some of the first translations of Kierkegaard. So it was an important source for Heidegger. I think Rilke is someone he will have read basically from his earliest reading experiences. And of course, the problem is, or the difference is, that when Heidegger was a university professor, basically it was not, you could do it, but it was not a very common thing to do lecture courses on poets. Of course, Heidegger, in a sense, does never do a lecture course on a poet, but is entering into a conversation with him and trying to do what he calls an elucidation of the poetry. So after 1945, and he basically didn't, he no longer was a university teacher, although he gave some courses still in the early 50s. But then he could focus more and more on poetry, and also the whole problem of language is one of the dominant themes in his later work. It's not only in On the Way to Language, Unterwegs zur Sprache, but also in unpublished writings. He wrote a lot about Hölderlin, which was only published in the Gesamtausgabe, for example. So Heidegger was also playing with different kinds of poetry, and often it's hard to understand what he was reading. He read Lorca in the German translation, for example. He also read everything Celan published. He also knew Gottfried Benn and his kind of poetry, so he was up to date, I think, in that respect. He had some relations also with women who were either writing poetry or were very well versed in poetry. What do I think of Heidegger's own poetry? A good poet or an embarrassment? Um, Depends on what you understand under Heidegger's own poetry. It's he only he wrote some poetry, of course, some poems. Some poems he even published when he was a young boy. He wrote poetry for some of the ladies he was acquainted with. Gedicht in de Gesamtausgabe is the question. What's the German name of the volume? It's I'll have to look it up probably for some. Yeah, Gedachtes. So it's translated as it's the 81. That's right, but it's not really poetry. It's what he calls hints or Winke in German. So it's Heidegger was not a poet, but he was very poetical in his writing, I think. So as a poet, a pure poet, he's not going to be counted as one of the main poets of the 20th century in Germany. But as a thinker, his language has this poetic quality, especially his later writings after, let's say, 1945. Yes, it's the volume Gesamtausgabe 81, which has this volume Gedachtes. Is this volume Gedachtes? Was translated into English by a poet. But there's this. I think you need a bit of an affinity with Heidegger's play with language, in a sense, and there it might be very helpful if you're a poet yourself. But I don't think that Heidegger is really. It's of course he published hardly any of his poems, so I think he was. But we can see. Let's see, Kiesley has a question. Was thinking Heidegger's first love, or was it being? Perhaps it was Aletheia. Who was Heidegger's muse? Well, he had several muses, so take your pick, basically. I think maybe thinking is Heidegger's first love, because in the end, it's the thing that matters most to him. I think he sacrificed even his marriage, in a sense, his love affairs, to this great task of thinking, which he expresses in this famous letter to his friend Engelbert Grapes in 1919, that he feels this inner calling, almost as if he was called by God to become a thinker and not a priest. And that started Heidegger on his lifelong way of thinking. I'll use the word way in the future. That is made up of several different paths all the time. So for being in time, you could point to Hannah Arendt. I think the Scotus book, If There's a Muse, it's Elfrida, his wife. In the early stages of their marriage, you can see that reflected in later love affairs. At the beginning, their first year is very intense, and Heidegger's talking a lot about his work as well. And then I say the fire no longer burns, but the embers still smaller. So there's still a little of light and warmth, but it's not this ecstatic kind of love that he, in a sense, needs to do his writing. It's this feeling, maybe it's kind of this moment of Hingabe, of letting yourself go or just give yourself to someone else. It's similar in its giving to thinking. I think that's expressed by this famous line We do not come to thoughts, thoughts come to us. So if you give yourself over to the mystery or to and owning rightness, then it may come to you. You can't force it. You cannot force your understanding of what a rightness may be. You have to pass through it in a sense, make this experience, which of course the most clear spelled out in Being and Time, I think. There is no objective approach to human being. If you want to know what it is, you have to take this moment that it is your life, that you care about it, that it matters to you, that the things in the world matter to you, that you encounter, that the people in the world matter to you. That's something you can never bring to light in an objective description, which was, of course, the main point of critique of Nathorp against phenomenology, that it pretends to do something which it can't do. And that's why Heidegger is so much thinking about the right method and how to approach the liveliness of life, and how can you capture the liveliness of life in of course you cannot get it if you write it down. The moment you start writing it down, you lose it. So that's why he uses formal indications and tries to point to the experiences in our existence and where you can find them. So you can make the same experiences Heidegger went through. And then with this going through the experience, the knowing in a deeper sense happens. And then you know what anxiety is. As you may know what wonder is, or you may know what love is, or friendship. So it's only going through it. If you've never been through this experience, it's you may understand that they have the same problem. You may understand the meaning of poetry, but you don't get the sense. It's the thing you can't catch. It's only if you go through it yourself that you know both the meaning and the sense. You can say to people can say to each other, we'll get married and we'll stay together for the rest of our lives. But then everybody can understand the meaning of what is being said, but the sense of it, that you really dedicate your life to someone else or to your basically to your joint life. And that's something a lot of people I think especially today forget, that it's promised to build up a joint life, and this joint life is different from the life you had before. And it's not a matter of doing a kind of pluses and minuses and then say, well, I like my boyfriend still 2.7, so that's still above the minimum level of 6, and we can compromise about this or that, but you have to create something new, I think. So that's about the muse. Well, the next question is very easy. Do you know if the correspondence between Heidegger and Karl Jaspers has already been published? Of course it has. It has been for a long time already. There's an English translation as well. I don't know if there's a Portuguese one. I think they were published something in the late 80s of the last century. There are some interesting letters, and there's also a lot of letters that don't give so much. But especially at the beginning, when they were still close friends and had an idea of fighting together against the ordinarius, the ordinarian, the full professors who had a chair and were dominating the university, and in the way it was governed, and in the way the teaching was organized, and the students, etc. Hello, Jose, Christine. I don't know, get some itchy throat. Well, if there's anybody else, I hope the answers bring something. It's still a bit of weird to be talking to my own screen and not seeing somebody as I do with Zoom, where you can see people. Here it's just me. Well, so I can also talk a bit about the things that we have coming up in the. As you may know, I spent some time with Louise in Meskirch, and we did some videos together of the. I'll finish this little story and then I get back to the next question. Um, so we were in Mesquite to shoot some videos, and in the videos I tell a little bit about some of the main sites in both ways, with the GHG and TE of Heidegger in Mesquite. So the place where he lived as a boy, the school, the church, the castle, the Hofgarten, the Veldweg, the country path, etc., etc. We'll be putting them up on this channel over time as Louise finished them. We recorded them with sound and image separately, so you have to glue them together afterwards to get them both together. So that's something I'm looking forward to, especially for people who probably will never have a chance to come to Mesquite. If you live in Germany, you can always say, well, one day I'm going to drive down there, take the train, and I'll be in Mesquite. But if you're living far away, it may not be possible for you. So then it might be nice to see Mesquite as it is today. You can still see some of the sites that Heidegger himself saw, and you begin to realize how small the world was in which he grew up as a boy, till he was 14 when he went to the gymnasium in Constance. Constance is a beautiful city on Lake Constance, and a lot bigger than Mesquite. So Heidegger's world began to broaden as he, in the first 3 years that he spent there, and then he moved to Freiburg to finish his high school education. And Freiburg was, of course, a city with a university and very close to France, and that also introduced Heidegger to the famous Black Forest, where his wife built this cabin for him in 1922. It was paid for by her parents. It was also in light of the inflation at the time. So better spend the money now that's still there than wait another 10 years and then the money is all worthless. So that's also something that played a role in that story. Have I ever come, Louise asked, a text that surprised me? A Heidegger text. Yeah, there's one. It's a very small text. It's the one I discovered myself. It's a text. It's only an announcement of a lecture that Heidegger was going to give in Mesquite for the Junggesellenverein, which is the kind of the Virgin Young Men Association. So people were still very serious about things in those days. And I was looking. I have the text. It's also on a go, some of this stuff. So he writes about the counting horses, die Rechnen Pferde. And I was reading die Rechnen Pferde. This cannot be possible. How can Heidegger write about counting, calculating horses? Then I did some research, and it turns out there was a very famous horse at the time in Berlin called Hans. And Hans seemed to be capable of counting. If you would ask Hans how much is 4 plus 5, he would knock with his hoof 9 times on the floor. So there were one of the things that got popular at that time was animal psychology. So there were a lot of very serious psychologists traveling to Berlin to watch the wonder. But in the end, it was proven that the horse didn't count or did not calculate, but it was his trainer who gave him signals, so he knew how many times he had to. But that in itself is also a problem. If the horse knows himself how many times he has to knock on the floor, then he's still counting. But anyway, it was a hoax. I have to read it again. It's some of this early stuff of Heidegger is really weird. Okay, then we got the next one. Dawson is asking me, is it true that Heidegger was largely unimpressed with Sartre's being and nothingness and Sartre's own interpretation of Heidegger's being and time? I'm not even quite sure that Heidegger read L'être et le néant. He certainly read existentialism as an humanism, which of course is the text that he replies to in his famous letter on humanism. But it's, I think for Heidegger, the problem with Sartre, with most modern thinkers of his time who are interpreting or developing his thinking further, is that Sartre missed the main point of doing an existential analytic as a preparation for a fundamental ontology. And it's, in that sense, it's similar. Sartre makes, also in my opinion, a lot of ontic misreadings of what should be ontological. It's similar to Binswanger, who wanted to add some points to existential analytic. It's also dark in Heidegger. He talks so much about anxiety and death, but there's also friendship and love, and I'm going to squeeze in some bits about friendship and love. Of course, Heidegger and Binswanger got to know each other in 1929 when he was giving one of his lectures on a tour through the Ruhr area. So the cities like Essen, Bochum, Dortmund. He also went to Cologne and Frankfurt. And in Frankfurt, he met Binswanger, who came to listen to him talk about the title is something with the metaphysics of Dasein. And that's where Binswanger got interested in Heidegger, and then in 1942 he published his main work based on his reading of Being and Time as a new contribution to psychiatry and psychotherapy, to put it very simple. So I think that of all Heidegger's many students, there are maybe there's no one who really got Heidegger. But the point of getting Heidegger is that you don't have to get Heidegger. You need to get your own thinking. And that you can see in all these people that were inspired by him, like Gadamer, Jonas, Max Müller, Rahner, Bultmann, Brücker. There are many. Arendt, Lewitt. You can go on for quite a bit of time. Then we'll go to the fourfold. Somebody's wondering about the fourfold. What were Heidegger's influence on this source, and why do you think he used it? It's you find the first traces of the fourfold in the contributions, and there it's not the same way as he develops it later in the 50s. But it's the basic notion is that if you try to open up the Da, or the openness of Dasein, that in Being and Time, it's still Dasein that is projecting. And of course, there is this notion of Gewovenheit, and there's this notion of disposition, but it seems like a constant projecting that we're doing. And you still have then the problem of in Being and Time, you have basically three different ways of being. You have readiness to hand, you have present at hand, and then existence, which belongs to Dasein. And there's no place, for example, for the work of art in the way Being and Time is set up. You could add it, of course, later, but he doesn't talk about art. It's something that he starts getting interested in the early 1930s. I think it has a lot to do with his visit to Amsterdam in Holland, where he gave 2 papers in Amsterdam and The Hague. And he was capable of seeing most of the first Van Gogh exhibition, where there were about more than 100 paintings at least of Van Gogh. And it seems from the way he talks about it in his letters to his wife, it was really a very impressive event for him and a great experience. And that got him thinking about about art, and the first fruits of that. So on the one hand, the first lecture course on Hölderlin from winter semester 1934-35, and then in 1935 he wrote the first drafts or the first versions of the origin of the work of art. But in the fourfold, human beings are not separated from. It's still a subjectivist moment that's in being and time. In this notion of Meinigkeit, in each case minus, and in Vereinzelung, individuation. So if you think about the fourfold, it's the unity and the constant mirroring of the four. It is heaven and earth, and the mortals and the divinities. And since they mirror each other, you can never say something about the one without at the same time saying something about the other three. So it's an attempt to describe something which cannot be grasped in metaphysical terms, you would say. It's this, we live on the earth, under the sky, and we experience in our mortality the moment of transcendence. And then, of course, there are a lot of different ways that Heidegger talks about this moment of transcendence. It can be the holy, it can be the divinities, sometimes it's the last God, it can be the gutter of Hölderlin or flat. So it leaves that open. It's not giving you the final say. I think when he says that death is the final Gebiet des Seins, it's in Gebiet you have all the different ways of bergen, verbergen, entbergen. Berg in the sense of saving. It's also a saving moment in it. So, and we don't know what will be there after we're dead. So, but there is a kind of comfort in this notion of different ways of being preserved in some sense, although we know not in what sense. And then you get to the religious explanations of these kinds of things that happen to us in life. Louise is back. I know you've published Heidegger texts outside of the Gesamtausgabe. Are there any particular important texts that are not part of the GA? Yes, there are some. It's interesting that they didn't publish the first text Heidegger ever wrote, Alle Seelenstimmungen, which you find published for the first time in the local journal in Westkirch of the local historian society, basically. They do a lot of research on the history of Westkirch and the surroundings. And I published it in a book I did together with Elspeth Bugin, Heidegger and his homeland, Heidegger und seine Heimat. It's in there. Another interesting exception is, I think, this famous seminar from 33, 34. Correct, über Naturgeschichte state, so on nature, history, and the state, which is an important text. The reason they didn't publish it in the Gesamtausgabe was that there was no Heidegger manuscript of it, only the Seminarbuch, so the protocols that were kept by the students who were attending the seminar. But Heidegger checked what they had written. So it's a pretty reliable source. And later, for some reason, they started publishing these seminar books as well, or what they call the referaten, the short presentations of students where they recapture what was said in the last session. So as an introduction to the next session, and Heidegger would comment on it as well. So that's another one. There are some I don't know I think there's an interesting text, as far as I know, from Peter Trafny. There's an ordner dedicated to Marx in the still unpublished literary remains, and it will not be published in these 2-3 additional volumes they are planning. This stuff from the Nachlass, as it's not published in the Gesamtausgabe. There are more texts there, but it's so there are some texts that are really that are important in my opinion, are not in the Gesamtausgabe. I've seen some stuff also in the manuscript. Another example is that I used the paper he used to write his very first lecture courses on in 1915-16 again in my book, because there was a huge shortage of paper, and you would reuse your paper as much as you could. That's why Heidegger writes incredibly small in those years. Later it's better readable. So, and there he so if you turn the page of the manuscript of Marburg lecture course, and you can find some traces on some of them of these very early lecture courses. It's something you can do systematically. I started doing it with Ted Kizil at a certain point, and we got a few things together. So Dawson is asking about how familiar I am with Sloterdijk's work on Heidegger. Quite a few people I have tried to discuss Sloterdijk with have had unpleasant things to say about him. Well, it's nice that for once they're not having unpleasant things to say about Heidegger. I don't know his work too well. And, well, he always hears stories about people, but I don't think that's really... doesn't really add something to the matter of thinking. He is, of course, provocative, and he tries also to tickle people a little, to wake them from their slumbers, so they become more aware of what's going on in the world. Of course, any good philosophy, you could say, is always irritating people. If it doesn't irritate anyone, it's not really worthwhile reading it. But I need to catch up on my Sloterdijk, I guess, at some point. There are always so many things to do. It would be nice to have 3 months of reading or something, just to read a lot of stuff, not only Heidegger, but other philosophers as well, and secondary literature. But I don't know when it's going to happen. It will happen one day. Then we get to another question. Could you say more about these additional GA volumes they are planning? Any idea what they consist of, where in the GA they will come, and when they will be published? Well, that's basically when you take everything that's published in the Gesamtausgabe out of the room, you are left with about 25,000 notes. And a note can be just one sentence, even just one word, which for some reason Heidegger didn't throw away, he didn't burn it, so they kept it. Heidegger seems to have thought it was not worthwhile burning it, so it may be worthwhile keeping it in the other direction. But it's what they want to do is they already had a visit of Marburg. That was Ulf Heidegger, executioner of the literary estate, the son of Hermann Heidegger, the grandson of Martin Heidegger. And then Peter Trafny was with them, and Klaus Held. And Klaus Held is a German philosopher that not everybody may be familiar with, but he was also highly influenced by Heidegger and considered himself to be a Heidegger student. And he He was picked by Heidegger himself to do one of the first volumes of the Gesamtausgabe as an editor. But Klaus Held is over 80 years old, so if I can imagine if you spend 2 days there, I know the place and I know what it's like, and you go through approximately 25,000 notes. Don't think after 2 days you have a clear idea of what's worthwhile and what's not. But anyway, they think they are capable of picking enough stuff for 2 or 3 volumes. They don't know the exact number yet. And they will be published not in the Gesamtausgabe, but as an addition to the Gesamtausgabe. Of course, it's still a way to make some money as well, because people will be buying them probably, in libraries for sure. So, and then there's a text dedicated to Marx. How does it read? Well, the problem is it's a cover, and within or an ordner, and in this ordner there are several notes, and some notes may be a text of 5, 6, 7, 10 pages. But I've never seen it because it's not accessible. So it's and if they keep it under locks, I think the way to do it is to publish it on the internet, to make a website. And of course, you can put limits on it as to what people can see and do. And you can say you need some kind of accreditation, or you need a serious product if you want to get access to the material. But then you could do a scan of all these notes. You have to do it anyway. If you publish them on the internet, and if you got some more money, you can ask somebody to do a first transcription of the notes as they are being published. And then people can look for themselves, and you can see maybe you can order them in a chronological way. Some of the earlier stuff you can distinguish from the later stuff on the basis of Heidegger's handwriting. You may be able to find texts that belong together. There's some systematic connection between some of these notes. So it would make it much more interesting, I think, for people, and it makes more sense than just publishing it. If you publish it, well, you may leave out the best bits, as of course the critique that they will get is that they still cover up things. Because if you don't publish everything, it's always possible to say, well, this is not, it's all fine and nice, but the really anti-Semitic National Socialist stuff is still in the archive, and they don't dare to publish it. Which I think is not true, but that's the way of doing it. If you just make it transparent, and everybody can read and see what is being said on these notes. And then we get to what would you say to those who defend that Victor Farias' perspective about Heidegger is both systematic, his historical guideline, and also filling some of his formal indications with concrete content. Well, that's an interesting and not so easy to answer question. I think it's he's doing it in some sense, especially when you start filling in the content. You have to be very careful, because the content is based on, let's say, on concepts. And these concepts, as Heidegger uses them, are often quite different from the ordinary way of understanding them. So that can lead to, I think, massive misinterpretations. So I think that this whole discussion with Farias and people like Fay and Sidoni Kellerer, and in France you have even a group of 7, 8 people, is important. It's easy to find some mistakes and say, well, let's see, it's all nonsense, so we can forget about it. There are some really hard questions, and I think we should try to answer these hard questions and in an honest way and to the best of our abilities. On some points I disagree with these people, also with Farias. And it's with fire, there's often a tendency to really intentionally present the text not in the way you should read them. Because he writes in French, so he's translating. If you're translating everything, for example, like Stamm, folk, so as race, then of course you find a lot of racist writings in Heidegger, although these concepts have little to do with race. So they can, I think he often gives he's not honest in his reading of Heidegger. Of course, you can say that von Herman is not honest in his reading of Heidegger as well, but the only conclusion can then be to try to be as honest as you can and present the material as we find it and it is available, and also put it in I think it's always important to put it in the historical context. It's not just in the case of Heidegger. It's also the case with Konrad Gröber, who was the Archbishop of Freiburg during the Nazi dictatorship, and he had to find a way of talking to the political authorities because he was an archbishop. You have to take care of your flock and defend their interests as much as you can. So we have a tendency to judge people by standards that we only invented last year, and then say, well, if you look at this with our standards, then it's all racist, sexist, etc. I think the historical part is always in a sense, the most important part, because you can hopefully learn something from mistakes. And I often give examples like until the early 20th century, the idea that women should go to university was pretty impossible. It was kind of self-evident that as a woman you couldn't go to university. That was a men's world. A lot of professors in those years still had problems with it. Even Husserl, who didn't want to do a habilitation with a female student, although she might qualify in all the senses of the word. And some of them were pretty brilliant, even more brilliant than most of the guys. But it's blindness that every time brings with it. And there his history is important, that you can, I think there are Heidegger mistakes that he makes that you can point to and discuss and say, well, it has to do with his philosophy, yes. Is it the essence of his philosophy? I would say no. So then you can both explain how his life is intertwined with his philosophy and how his philosophy is influenced by his life. With the notion of Geworfenheit, with this thrownness and facticity, I think they are good indicators. Heidegger was born as a boy in Meschede in 1889, which was part of the German Empire at the time. It was a very Catholic country. There were some new Catholics and there were some Protestants, but very little. The vast majority of people were Roman Catholics. So he grew up in that world. He was an altar boy. He rang the bells in the bell tower, and these experiences from his youth, I think, stayed with him. Of course, you reinterpret them, and they are being transformed, but it's part of who and what he was. And of course, in philosophy, it's the same thing. It's the discourse of the time you are working in that, to a large extent, determine what you will be talking about. So you find it, especially in the early Heidegger, with his many lectures and lecture courses on the idea of philosophy. What is philosophy? Is it a science? It's not a science. And he has different answers over time. He begins by saying philosophy is a science, but not in the normal sense. It's a primal science, Urwissenschaft, or in the sense of Fichte's doctrine of science. So in Buddhist metaphysics, he's still defending the position more or less. There is, and later he will say philosophy is not a science. It cannot be a science. It's something different from science. And it's raising the questions that and trying to answer the questions that science cannot answer about itself. What is physics is not a physical problem or a problem of physics. If you want to discuss it, you have to think, and if you start thinking, you're no longer doing physics, but you're doing philosophy. Which he did, of course, with famous people like Heisenberg and von Weizsäcker, who were both outstanding physicists, but within philosophical interest as well. I think that's the reason why they got on with Heidegger. So that would be my bit on that question. I don't know if anybody else still has something. It doesn't have to be. We can talk about the upcoming conference we're doing on Dasein analysis. It's organized by me and Miles Gross. Join the effort of this center, European Center of Heidegger Studies, that I'm trying to pull out of the mud with the help of Louise. Part of it is this YouTube channel. We'll start working on a website as well. We have the Heidegger Forum on Facebook. So we're just putting things together and trying to develop them further. So this Dasein analysis conference is the 18th until the 20th, from around 5 o'clock till 9 o'clock in the evening. And we have, I think, an interesting group of people speaking. So if you're interested in learn a bit more about Dasein analysis, psychotherapy, psychiatry, and maybe worth your while to attend. And then I think everybody here is English speaking. I'm doing some German things starting also this month. It will continue until December, and then in January I'm doing the third Heidegger Zoom conference already. On Heidegger thinking from 1919 until 1929, let's say the whole being in time decade. So you can write a paper about Heidegger's lecture courses in Freiburg. At the beginning, you can write about the courses in Marburg. You can write about being in time. You can write about his relation to other philosophers like Löwit and Jaspers, etc., etc. The first people are beginning to make themselves known, so I can put it. So if you would be interested in either participating or presenting, drop me an email. My email address is on most of the stuff that I post as PDFs with announcements. So it's not too hard to find. And you can always have a discussion. I always say, not forget it, money should never be a reason not to attend. So if we ask for some fee, I have to live as well. I'm not paid by a university or something, so I have to earn my keep. And one of the ways of doing it, and a very pleasant way of doing it, is with all these Zoom events. And you can, but for me, it would be great if I could do it all for free and everybody could access it for free, but I simply cannot afford to do it. So, but in some cases we make exceptions. I can imagine if you're in, let's say, Afghanistan, paying money or even having a bit of money is very difficult. So in that case, I would say, okay, you can attend anyway. And there are some people who pay a bit extra to make it possible as well. So there's always something we can work out. And you can always pay later also. If you say, well, it's a bit tight at the moment, but I would like to do something. Money is only money in the end. And thinking is thinking. And thinking, for me, has always been more important than money. That's probably the reason I still need to earn some money nowadays. Should have gone into selling cars or being a stock market broker. Would have made more money probably, but have a less enjoyable life and a lot less of thinking. Sure, that's about. Oh, that's some stuff is still going on, and I will be doing new stuff all the time. So keep an eye out, and you can join in. Let's see. There's another question. I've been talking too much. Well, how important is what is called thinking, in your opinion? I keep returning to the text because Heidegger addresses so many key thinkers like Nietzsche and Spengler. Well, what is called thinking is, in a sense, also you could say it's. Let's see. You could say that the first unifying text, or where the different paths of research come together. The first one is the Nato report, and the second one is Being in Time. You could say the third one is Contributions to Philosophy. And I think what is called thinking is also a text that goes in that direction. Heidegger is basically also trying to present his latest thought to students, which in his opinion was always the most rewarding and the most important part of his work. And it's a beautiful text. And of course, with all Heidegger's texts that start with a question, the answer to the question is not in the book. So if you're looking for an answer, then you can avoid reading it, but it's trying to bring you to an experience of this kind of thinking that Heidegger talks about, which is no longer metaphysical and opens up, or also makes it possible to stay awake and prepared for another address of being. That's a long story. So I think Nietzsche is still a bit more important than Spengler. I know you're a Spengler fan, so you're excused. Heidegger already was writing about Spengler in the early 1920s, so you can find some. He mentions him also in the lecture courses there. So if you want to look for Heidegger's relation to Spengler, you can also look there. I might offer you some interesting bits to think about. Yes, Louise is remarking that the reading of Heidegger in Was heißt Denken of Noen and Legein versus his reading of Noen and Legein in the NATO report is very interesting. So that's maybe the advice for the weekend. Read the NATO report and then read Was heißt Denken and see where the similarities and the differences are. But that also shows it's a way of collecting the different passes into one way, in a sense. And in collecting it into a way, in one way, these different passes, you still keep going, but you lose something of the passes as such. But at the same time, it's not possible to do it differently, I think. And that would be a very interesting project, probably. Might do it one day. Start to read Heidegger's way of thinking as this constant shifting of passes of thinking and how they interact, and how one project may be the key to the beginning of a new project. The same with Besinnung and with Ereignis, which he uses very early. And then he leaves them by the side of the road, you would say, only to pick them up again in the 1930s and beyond. Besinnung never leaves them again. So that's the other part. I still have this little text I can do. So if I try to get, we keep building things up, which is always harder than breaking them. But it's more fun to build up than to break. Anybody who wants to ask something or has a comment or? Yes, it's Dawson is asking, Socrates is referred to as the purest thinker in What heißt Denken. Is this in part because Socrates did not write anything? Yes. So his thinking is not state thinking, you could say. was not put in the form of writing. And in the form of writing, it's also an interesting topic for Heidegger. It seems along also the Platonic notion of, in a sense, losing the liveliness of the thinking as it happens, or as it sich ereignet, as it is ennowned, is lost when you read a written text. And at the same time, it's of course amazing that, contrary to Socrates, who did not write anything, Heidegger didn't stop writing. So he's combining the two. And that has to do, I think, with the way his mind works. Heidegger is, through his writing, he's thinking. And he can only do his thinking, basically, as kind of writing. And well, if you want to do something like a fundamental ontology, then it's just to keep a hold of all the elements. It's of course easier if you have a written text, and you can make it easier for people also to come to an understanding of the text. Something to think about would be then Heidegger's lectures were essentially him reading a pre-written lecture, right? Yes, in his lecture courses, there are lecture courses where Heidegger did not have a written out text, and most of the time he did. But it's also related to this notion of thinking through writing. So, but he could do his thinking without the writing. He could. There were the Plato Sophist lecture courses, one where there was very little written material, basically, by Heidegger. If you read the text as it is published, it seems to be a worked out manuscript, but it's not. And in the way he prepared this, it's similar to Schelling. Schelling was also someone who always read from paper. But the people sitting in the audience had the feeling that he was developing a thought right there. And maybe it's the way he constructs his text. He wants to bring us to an experience of thinking. So he's taking you by the hand, in a sense, and trying to show you a path of thinking, so that you can come to an experience of thinking. Because you cannot teach people how to think; they have to learn it themselves, and you can only learn it by making the experience. In that sense, as he is, you can see it in the manuscripts, he's always underlining and using different colors to make his reading of the text almost as if he's not reading it, but speaking it without the text. Maybe it's interesting to note that Gadamer was the exact opposite. He hardly ever used the manuscripts. And he was once invited to give a lecture, and he was first invited to lunch, and then the people inviting him asked him, he had no briefcase with him, and there was no apparent sign of a manuscript. Where his manuscript was. He said, "Well, I don't have one." And they looked very worried. And then I'm losing my thread. But so he got a beard settle, so the little carton thing you put your beard gloves on, and he jotted down a few words. Said, "Well, now you have my lecture, so you can be enjoying your lunch and don't be scared that I won't be able to talk." But we're going to try and do it one day with a recording of Heidegger, when he's reading himself the text that we're going to discuss, and then see if it makes a difference when he's reading it himself instead of me or somebody else reading it. And will be an experiment, but it might be interesting. Then we have another question. Could you please comment on Heidegger's interpretation of Nietzsche's understanding of love and hate? That both love and hate are not blind, but seeing, hellsichtig. GA 6.1. I don't have the passage at the top of my head. But he's... so I have to figure it out as I'm sitting here. This notion of hellsichtig is clear for Jan. I think in English would be the translation. So it's similar, I think, to Heidegger's notion of moods. So because Dasein is always has a disposition. I don't have the text here, but I can look the text up. Let's see, I can do it quickly. Then I'll. You can see what I'm doing here probably when I'm going for. What did you say? Let's see. Page 45. Okay, let's see. I can't share my 45. I'm getting close. 45, bit higher. This 40, too high. 45, 42, 43, 44. Getting there. 45. Let's see. Daar is niet blind. It's let's see, where are you? You must be here somewhere. There you are. To put it in a nutshell, I think what Heidegger is trying to point out is that when you hate someone, you see very clearly. You want to try to hurt the person you hate as much as possible. So you're thinking about how to do it. If you're very angry, you don't think about it. You get lost in your anger. And let's say you strike someone out of anger, you give somebody a slap in his face. That's a form of blindness. It's also in our language. It went dark before my eyes. I couldn't see anything anymore. But in hate, you can be very subtle and clearly seeing what you're going to do to hurt someone as much as you can. And with love, it's the same thing. In love, you care about the others, but it's a form of Fürsorge or of solicitude, as it's translated. It's making way, kind of. You want the other to be. Heidegger often quotes Augustine. Amo ut sis. I love you, so I want you to be. I love what you are. I love you as you are. I don't want you to change. I see you for who you are. That kind of notion. So that's also a moment of clairvoyance. You see clearly what the other is. And that's why if you want the person you love to change into something you can love, then you have not understood what love is. Love is this kind of just accepting, and it's also, you find it in the notion of Gelassenheit. Love is a kind of Gelassenheit, of letting the other be and unfold his or her own existence. It's the same relation you have as a parent with your children. There's also, it's not so important what I think they should do. It's important that they find something they're passionate about and they find their own way in life. They don't have to do what I do. They can please find your own way. And that kind of notion is it. So I hope that helps a bit. And I'll go on to, I wonder how Heidegger differentiates between Stimmung, Mood, and passion, Leidenschaft. I think the... Nou, papa, nou is met Russisch daar bezig. There's Heidegger always uses formal indications, so there also you have to be attuned in a sense. The main notion is this disposition Befindlichkeit. And in German, Befindlichkeit can go into in two different ways. It's literally where you are. Ich befinde mich zu Hause. I'm at home. I'm in Paris. That is sich befinde. That's where you are. And it can also be how you feel. Ich befinde mich wohl. I feel good in a sense. So it has these two notions. It's a kind of the place where existence happens, where our existence happens. And at the same time, it's a thing that has its fundamental attunements, and fundamental attunements are the ones that, in a sense, open up the world. And a fundamental attunement is anxiety is one where you open up the future. And if you open up your future and are willing to see it as it is, you become aware of mortality. You can do another one would be wonder, which is the beginning of philosophy, according to both Plato and Aristotle. So then the world is also, there's a certain kind of mood also of respect, and then Gelassenheit is, in a sense, also a fundamental attunement. It's not just letting things be, but it's being in this mood of letting things be, and not out of disinterest, but basically out of love. And I think that's where you can find these things, and a mood is something that's just more fluid. A mood can overcome you. A fundamental attunement cannot. That's why you can get angry. You can get upset, and you can get a lot of different moods. But the mood is not a fundamental attunement. And passion and Leidenschaft belong to, also in a different sense, to Dasein, because it's always passionate. It's already in the notion of encountering. And in Heidegger, you have a lot of talk about strife, and now that's also a part of being. It's not just, it's also what makes movement possible, and development, and history. So that's what I would say about that. Then there's another one. How can Dasein's deconstruction, Derrida's deconstruction, help us to understand the later Heidegger with the gentle law of Ereignis? Yes, the answer that Redbox gives is a good one. It can and it can't. So I think Derrida's notion of deconstruction is developed from Heidegger's notion of destruction. And in Heidegger, it basically means the same thing. It is taking a part of things that are covered over original experiences. It's these layers of interpretation, so we no longer see the thing as it was discovered at the beginning, but we only see the words that were used later to describe it. I think I always give the example of nature and the Greek notion of physis. Greek notion of physis is very, when we get back to the fourfold, Heidegger's understanding of the physis in his repetition or his retrieval becomes the fourfold. And the notion is that the physis is where things disappear out of concealment into unconcealment. So it's also an openness, physis. And if you think about Anaximander, everything that comes into physis comes from apeiron, from the unlimited, finds its limit and its time, and moves through, let's say, unconcealment, through physis. And when it dies, as all finite things must, or falls apart, in the case of non-living things, it passes back into the apeiron. And maybe someday it will come back. Anaximander doesn't tell us. You could say that Nietzsche is trying to say that everything that ever was comes back exactly as it was for an eternity or eternally. So I think that's also something that Derrida is trying to get at. That, of course, then physics is later translated as natura, which is related to birth, which is very different from the Greek understanding of physics, and later it becomes nature. And nature becomes then, at the end, the bestand of our day today. And if you think about nature in the sense of the physics, then it has nothing to do with the Greek understanding of physics anymore, although you use the same word. So if you then try to read into the Greek understanding of physics, what we understand in a natural science kind of way as nature, then you completely will miss the original experience. My friend was Niederhaus and well, Dawson says, I can't speak for everyone in philosophy today. However, my friend Johannes Niederhauser and I are a little tired of hearing about Derrida's Heidegger. Well, that can happen. But it's still... you don't need to debate about Derrida to understand Heidegger, in a sense. You can leave him out of it, because Derrida had no influence on Heidegger. That's a difference with, let's say, Kant or Aristotle. So, but you can have a serious discussion about Derrida's reading of Heidegger. I think Derrida is often insightful and brings something new to the table, and at the same time, he sometimes loses himself in a kind of empty wordplay, where it doesn't bring that much anymore. And then it's, of course, like Heidegger, the students are always worse than the master. If people start Heideggering, then for me, it's also end of the story. Heidegger is not about giving definitions and adhering to a certain language game. It's about thinking and thinking for yourself. And if you catch something from a text of Heidegger, you would be very happy. It's this one moment we say, aha, it's something I never knew that or didn't realize that. It's a moment of clarity. Then you have the moment of clearing, of lichten, in very simple things of them. Sometimes people are surprised if you tell them that breakfast is really break fast. It's the breaking of the fasting time. So the normal way of life is fasting. And you break it because you need something to eat. Nowadays, it's more the other way around. We're eating all the time. We don't fast anymore. And well, time is coming up to it's almost 8:30. Yes, it's the last comment, and then I'll start on my text. Albert, I like how Heidegger thinks about the power at the very beginning, which holds life and death together, the unity and complexity. That's one of the main problems of philosophy. Where's the unity? And how can we understand the unity? And the unity must be something in its simplicity that can be very complex. But the fourfold has this notion as well. It's this folding of four into one. As Heidegger said, the kind of thinking I'm trying to develop or to practice is, in its essence, much simpler than scientific thinking or philosophy. But in the enactment, much more difficult, and it needs a long training. So you need to, and that's one of the things that are interesting with the webinars, where you find, where you often come across these moments. I think it already helps if you start reading a text with other people. Then it's the text speaks differently than when you read it on your own. And of course, the tendency is nowadays much often just to be on your own and do your own reading and writing, but in this exchange of views about the same sentence, I see it a bit differently than you do. You have the feeling that you get closer to the text or the meaning of the text. So I'll have a sip of water, and then I'll. Let's see. There's no one on you. Where are you? You are here. Yes, Louise. It's always this position. If you read the Veldweg on the Veldweg, it's different than when you read it in an apartment building in New York. So that's also the dimension of text, of writing, of language that we often forget, and which Heidegger is basically talking about the whole time. There's never this disinterested view of the beholder. You don't behold your own life as if it has nothing to do with you. There may be moments in your life when you're looking at yourself and you think, what the heck am I doing? But that's different from, it's even an expression of being interested in it. So anyway, I have this little text. I'll have to read it. So it's on the mortality of love. If you're interested. If you're not, then you're leaving. Then thanks for joining so far. Have a nice evening. I can't see you at the moment. I can never see you. But let's. It's about the mortality of love, a reflection. As soon as man is born, he's old enough to die. The saying of the Bohemian tiller is cruel. Cruel because the phrase says a newborn child is old enough to die. With Heidegger, we can ask ourselves whether a small child can die at all. For can it be capable of death as death? Kann es den Tod als Tod vermögen in German. But there is also the saying of Epicurus. He says, the most dreadful evil, death, does not concern us. For as long as we exist, death is not there. And when death is there, we no longer exist. It's a epistle to Meno Isius, 125. If you want to. We could ask if death is not there in our lives as the possible impossibility of my existence. Is death not a shadow that falls over our life and in that sense discloses our mortality? Being in time, Heidegger makes use of his hermeneutics of primordial facticity, in which it has come to light that Dasein usually and first understands itself from its being lasting concern for the world, as everyone does. Its ontic existential possibility of authenticity would therefore have to be thought in the opposite direction. Yet the question remains whether Dasein can ever cope with the possibility that its existence offers and can assimilate it in its full individuality and totality. Here too, at the heart of his thinking, in Being in Time, we again encounter the life question of 1919. Who am I to be? It's Heidegger's problem at the time. Heidegger can only disclose primordial facticity by actualizing it himself. It's always Selbstvollzug, German self-actualizing. Precisely because he moves on the fundamental level of the primordial deep, the Ursprung in German, of facticity. He cannot derive his idea of existence from the Greek Christian or modern life experience. Since Dasein is first and mostly lasting concern for the world and fallen to the everyone, it takes a turnaround, kere, to free it from its inauthentic existence. The call of conscience, according to Heidegger, interrupts the everyday being involved with the world of an inauthentic self that merges with the everyone and calls on Dasein to obey the demands of its unique situation. Dasein must be called upon to face its own situation and choose its authentic projecting. Its existential turnaround bears the traces of Plato's pedagogy and Christian conversion. In his own existence, Heidegger must, as it were, bear witness to an authentic can be, sein können. The call of conscience is, as Heidegger says, as such an appeal. It summons the self to its potentiality for being itself, and thus calls Dasein force to its possibility. It's Silent page 253, or in the translation 319. Conscience tells us what we can that we can authentically be ourselves and therefore responsible. In its phenomenological analysis of conscience, Heidegger constantly comes up against the limits of language. Conscience is the formal indication of an ontological structure, which is the condition of possibility of the philosophical pedagogy and the Christian conversion. Conscience, of course, cannot be a faculty of the soul. Heidegger says, in conscience, Dasein calls itself. Conscience is the formal indication of the phenomenon that there is called out factically in Dasein. Whenever Heidegger encounters as kept it gives, as roofed it calls, we find ourselves in the structure of primordial facticity. There is, it gives, it whirls, and it calls. Because Dasein is always mine. They can only be called in the individual Dasein. The call of conscience does not make us understand a general ideal of can be. Conscience calls me into the can be of my Dasein in its individual uniqueness, and thus brings me into the original truth of my existence. Practically, I simply am, and as my Dasein, I am who I am as having to be. I have to be, and I can be authentic or inauthentic. In this having to be lies the origin of my responsibility. My life is my answer to the call of conscience. Conscience in Heidegger is not, as in Kant and Fichte, the consciousness of obligation. It is here an existential structure, which is the condition of possibility of our consciousness of obligation. There is no ethics here yet, because Dasein is the being that has to be. The traditional theory of substance falls short as fundamental ontology. The essence, which lies in my existence, is not a substance and not a fixed possession. First and foremost, I lost myself. My property lies in my existence and is a possession that always eludes me. As understanding, I always have to be again and again, and therefore I have to constantly project and interpret my Dasein. Always having to be as something that is still due is the guilt or debt of Dasein. Heidegger has to formalize the idea of guilt in such a way that the vulgar guilt phenomena that are related to being concerned with others are eliminated from it. In every situation, Dasein is and can be what it is. It has to be and has what it has to be as a possibility. There's no excuse here. But to quote Fichte, I have to, so I can. The primordial facticity is that there is, as kept, that I am and I am involved in my being. Dasein has always been and always remains at the mercy of existence. Anna, kan je even die deur dicht doen in godsnaam? En dan heb je het goed dicht trekken. Ik word helemaal knettergek van jullie. It has been thrown into existence, not by itself, but to itself. This is the primordial facticity of Dasein. I find myself with others in a world and have to be. I didn't ask to be born and thrown into the world, but now that I am here, I have to be. Existence brings with it the obligation of having to be. I'm not the cause of my existence, I must become the cause of my existence by appropriating my Dasein. He says, and it's a quote from Being in Time, Dasein is not itself the basis of its being, inasmuch as this basis first arises from its own projection. Rather, as being itself, it is the being of its basis. This basis is never anything but the basis for an entity whose being has to take over being a basis. End of the quote. With the gift of my Dasein comes the obligation of having to be. Having to be is the price I have to pay constantly for my existence. Since my being has no end, as long as I exist, I can never pay this price in full, and I am indebted to my existence. Existence is both effectively givenness and a given task. Existence is the gift of being that it is in debt, schuldig, not in the sense of guilty. Because of its throwness, Dasein is originally lost in the concern dealing with the world and fallen to the one. In its being, Dasein is not yet concerned about its own can be, and it therefore exists inauthentically. Dasein is first and most of the time not existing authentically, and this nullity makes it guilty. The acceptance of this non-being entails the obligation of having to be. I must appropriate my existence, even if I will never be in full control of it. I have to be, and so I'm faced with the question of what I always have to be at each moment. In resoluteness, I gain insight into my situation, and it becomes possible for me to exist authentically. Resoluteness, Entschlossenheit in German, is the actualization sense of existence which demonstrates the possibility of authentic existential understanding. Heidegger says, quote, resoluteness, by its ontological essence, is always the resoluteness of some factical Dasein at a particular time. The essence of Dasein as an entity is its existence. Resoluteness exists only as a resolution, Entschluss, which understandingly projects itself. But on what basis does Dasein disclose itself in resoluteness? On what is it to resolve? Only the resolution itself can give the answer, end quote. Heidegger is forced to reintroduce the chirological term situation, a hitherto skipped existential phenomenon. I always have to be at every moment, that is to say, in every situation, as the disclosing of that moment. The situation is the here, which is disclosed in resoluteness, the there, as which the existent entity is there. The situation is only through resoluteness and in it. Situation is essentially always a concrete action situation that is disclosed in a concrete understanding. This concrete understanding is not imagining a possible situation and pondering what we would do in that hypothetical case. Understanding a concrete situation is always the projection of the decision. Dasein already acts resolute. Heidegger brings the Aristotelian doctrine of phronesis into play here. Quote Heidegger again. This makes it entirely plain that when the call of conscience summons us to our potentiality for being, it does not hold before us some empty ideal of existence, but calls us forth into the situation. End of the quote. In every situation, Dasein projects a certain existential conception of authentic existence. In every decision lies a factic ideal of Dasein. Resoluteness is, as Heidegger says, this reticent self-projection up on one's almost being guilty, in which one is ready for anxiety, an outstanding way of disclosing. Yet here too the possibility of error remains. The transparency of a situation is a play of shadow and light, because every situation is always mine and therefore unique and one-off. There remains no time for Kant's categorical imperative. In any factic situation, Dasein reveals its authentic can be, and is this revealing and being revealed. Thus Dasein comes into the authentic truth of its existence. Insight into my situation, resoluteness is also the decision in which the authentic existential understanding is expressed. Because anticipating my death as an almost existential possibility must be ontologically grounded in resoluteness. Heidegger must show how resoluteness can disclose the whole of my existence in every situation through the inclusion of the limit situation of the impossible possibility of my death. Can death have anything in common with the concrete action situation? Heidegger must show that resoluteness can absorb all aspects he found in being towards death. Hence, anticipating my death must no longer remain an empty existential ideal that must be justified and fulfilled in authentic existence. Existing is being in death. This death must be taken over in resoluteness. This is only possible if resoluteness in disclosing Dasein becomes so transparent to itself that being in death is understood as something constant. Such understanding is only possible if Dasein discloses it can be up to and including the end. As long as I exist, I have to be, and as long as I have to be, I have a debt that is outstanding. To be existentially at its end is understood existentially as being towards the end. It says, quote, as being towards the end which understands. That is to say, as in anticipation of death's resoluteness becomes authentically what it can be. End of quote. Authentic being towards death lies in resoluteness as the very existential modality of its own authenticity. Resoluteness must not only understand the various possibilities in each situation and decide what to be, it must disclose the situation as my situation. As we've already seen, Heidegger can only allow in each case mindness to spring from death as my own most ultimate and inalienable possibility. Resoluteness is, in its proper sense, insight into what I have to be in the concrete, unique, and one-off situation of my existence. Anticipating determination is the very existential understanding of the outstanding ultimate possibility, which is radically my possibility in individuality, which is certain to come and whose arrival remains uncertain. That is, of course, my death. My resoluteness puts me in the situation of my existence as a whole. This whole of existence is the paradigm and preliminary sketch from which the structure of the original temporality can be disclosed. In resoluteness, I project my existence as a whole, as I experience it from within. My existence is an ecstatic standing out in discoveredness or in the clearing of mortality. Now listen to the two sayings I quoted at the beginning of my lecture. We can set out in a different direction concerning the question of mortality. As soon as man is born, is old enough to die. The newborn baby is old enough to die. It seems to be true. Can a newborn baby die at all? Or, in Heidegger's words, can it be capable of death as death? Kan het den dood als dood vermeugen? It seems likely that she cannot, and that her life just ends. She's still too young to be mortal. The fourfold is the mirror play of heaven and earth, divinities and mortals, and it is an ontological structure. We must come into the world as mortals, and it cannot be a quality we may acquire at a certain age. We also heard the saying of Epicurus, most dreadful evil, death, does not concern us. For as long as we exist, death is not there. And when death is there, we no longer exist. It sounds nice and almost seems to be a comfort. But when a newborn baby dies, it is quite possible that I will be there and be touched by her death. Gaima died. Can Gaima die? Or was that just the pure end of her life? Didn't she die in my arms? Or did only her mother and I die? We do not yet know who Gaima Maria Ranki is, or better was, or better is. A long time ago, March 5th, 2010, I arrived in Meskies, of all places. It was already night. I went to sleep and set my cell phone alarm for 6:30. I was very tired and fell asleep quickly. Next thing I know, my cell phone rang. I turned off the alarm and turned around again to continue to sleep. It rang again. Then I didn't turn it off properly. Only then did I realize that it was only 6 o'clock. It was not the alarm clock. It was a phone call. It rang again. My wife was at home in France and in total panic. She was 25 weeks pregnant, in excruciating pain, and could barely walk. She had phoned the hospital and they wanted her to go there as soon as possible. The practical problems do not interest us here. You just need to know that I was in the hospital in Jep in France at about 5 o'clock p.m. The doctors were surprised that the birth had been delayed for so long. Therefore, the possibility of having the neonatology specialist come from the university clinic in Rouen. Did you know the gynecologist and my midwife were very nice and caring? The longer the birth was delayed, the better the chances of the unborn child. It was not until 11 o'clock that the decision was made to start the birth because the risk of infection was getting too great. The time in this poor room lasted endlessly. My wife had to come to terms with the fact that her child would not live. But I cannot live without my land of hope and dreams and love, so I try to hold on to every ray of hope. I will never forget how the doctor said to us, I cannot give you hope, but there is a chance, and as long as there is a chance, we will do everything possible. The birth lasted only 3 minutes. I cut the umbilical cord and placed little Chaim on the soft and warm chest of her mother. The tiny girl cried, and it was a heartbreaking sound. She was born from the safety of her mother's womb far too early into the misery of the world. Within 3 minutes she was born, and 2 minutes later she was gone. The long, endless wait began. In the room next door, the doctors examined her and prepared her for transport. Chaima was relatively heavy and had breathed on her own. After about 3 hours, we saw her again in an incubator with way too much equipment. We were able to say goodbye to her. She disappeared in the night to Rouen, and we spent the night in Jep at the hospital. We did not sleep. It's a suffocating feeling of powerlessness, and you do not know what to do at all. And slowly, but it is not boring and empty, but full of tension and stress and uncertainty. It was not until the next morning that the news came that Jaime was still alive and that her condition was stable. I saw her again in Rouen, and her breath. Then your breath catches because you can't imagine how small such a prematurely born child is. I couldn't imagine that she could survive. She weighed less than 800 grams, less than a packet of sugar. The most amazing thing was that she was complete with nails, hair. The skin is still so thin that it is transparent. The body is fatless somehow. She looked like an old woman and old enough to be capable of death. And then a time begins that cannot be put into words. First we stayed in the hospital, then in a hotel next door, and after 3 weeks we were back home. Only technology made it possible for her to be alive. Every day we saw struggle and suffer. The uncertainty is unbearable. It's uncertain whether she will die or not, but it is also uncertain that if things go well, she will not face a crisis 5 minutes later. The first 3 days are crucial. We were with her hours every day, at least 10, 12 or more, talking to her and trying to do everything possible, which is very little. For the prematurely born, it's very important to hear mother's voice, and somehow the little ones know that the mother is there. Once the first shock is over, anxiety about the future begins. If she survives, what marks will the premature birth leave behind? And that goes from children growing up with almost no problems to the most severe disabilities. Nobody knows how it will turn out. After 2 days, we were allowed to put her on our chests. That is an incredible feeling. I do not know. It's just so nice to be able to do something for her and give her love and warmth. There are always cardiac arrests, which are normal because the brain is still too immature and often forgets to signal the heart to beat. They usually pass quickly, but sometimes they don't. Mother starts to breastfeed her child, first 2 milliliters and slowly a little more. And after 4 weeks, we finally see the light at the end of the tunnel. Irma had survived a minor heart operation well. I cannot convey to you what it's like to be in the hospital for 12 hours or more every day. Almost heartbreaking to see your little sister at home so full of zest for life and strength. The contrast could not be more extreme. The art is in learning to take every day for yourself, every day for itself. Every good moment has to be tasted and enjoyed. I've learned that the really existential questions cannot be clarified rationally, like Heidegger says. We can't. We cannot make the most important decisions in life in peace in advance. This does not only apply to the decision to marry this woman or in order to spend the rest of my life with her, but also for the decision whether Jaime goes to Rouen or not. I finally understood during these weeks what determination means in being in time. They are the vital and defining choices we make by making them and accepting them as our choices and taking responsibility for them. Maybe that's the right word. I can talk about the circumstances under which I would rather end my life. I cannot decide until I am in the situation where I have to decide. On April 1st, we were again in the hospital until 1:30 in the morning. The doctor told us everything went well. On the trip to Rouen the next day, we thought about how to proceed. My mother-in-law had been with us for 4 weeks to take care of the other two daughters. She should also go home again, even if she would only stay there for a short time. When we got upstairs, we were immediately taken to the waiting room because the doctors were with Jaima. Her condition was very critical. Her intestines exploded within a few hours. She walked away from us on her bare chest after we finally freed her from the machines. She was just 4 weeks old. And the time is a time of its own when you have a child on your breast and you're waiting for it to die, and all you can do is try to give it all the love we had inside of us for a lifetime. This time cannot be calculated, and it's not a sequence of now moments. This time lasts endlessly and yet is over in a moment. I've learned that love is unconditional. Somehow I already knew that, but I love Jaima. I love her no less than her sister. Her sisters who are now 14 and 25. Jaima is present in her absence every day of my life. It's amazing how strong love can be for a 4-week-old child. When I close my eyes, I clear my head, I can still feel her comes on my chest, her hand gripping my finger. I hear her cry, so soft and fragile. What remains unbelievable is that from her family, only her big sister saw her twice. Her grandmother and all her relatives only saw her in photos and films when she was alive. They only saw Jaima physically when she was at our house after her death. She was laid to rest on April 9th. You know, when I'm asked how many children I have, I usually say I'm day 3, simply because I do not feel like talking about Jaima's too short life every time. But every time I feel like I'm betraying her if I don't talk about her, and I've not done that for a while. The pain is too great and too deep and will never go away. Somehow, I try to cover the pain every day, but she's still there every day. Jaima is there every day. It should not be that it is just something tragic in our lives. She certainly did not deserve that. There have also been those wondrous and unforgettable moments. The worst thing that can happen is that the parents tell their child that it would have been better if it had never been born. And here again, we come up against the limits of rationality. Would it have been better for Jaima if she had not lived? Her life was actually pure hell. And we have to deal with this thought somehow. Can there even be an answer to this question? If there were an answer, it can only be this: love. Because love is unconditional and only love allows pain to be transformed. Did Jaime die or just perish? This question, like all true questions, is simple because the very moment we ask the question, we lose the possibility of an answer. Asking is not the piety of thinking. The piety of thinking is, as Heidegger would later understand, letting be. Let Jaime die, and we can only let her die by loving her. Love and pain are the same. Love hurts, and only what we love can hurt us. Love is unconditional, inexplicable, irreducible, yet it is mortal. And the transformation of pain into love and love into pain is the daring of art and the secret of death. And for Jaime and her mother, I would like to take this risk for you. And I had to put it in some kind of words. Standing here beside you, at the place of no return, I need to find my voice, but what words may express her loss? I never thought I'd attend my daughter's funeral. How may you find hope in a place where life ends? How may I still say, I love you? Why, Jaime, why? Why were you in such a hurry to behold the light of day? Why couldn't you stay safe and warm beneath your mother's heart? I feel your skin on my chest, your tiny hand holding on to me. I hear you crying, so softly and helplessly. It breaks my heart. I see you before me, so small and defenseless, with too many wires attached to your body. Look at your mum and see how she cries. Together we give you everything, but it is far too little, and that hurts so much. Why, Jaime? Why? Why were you denied to see more of the world in an incubator in a sterile room? You never felt the rain, your clothes soaked and your hair wet, the sun caressing your smile. You never knew the beauty of starlit night. Why, Jaime? Why? We held you tight in our arms. We were there for you every day. We fought together for an ending that was not to be. Mama bought you clothes so incredibly small and still far too big. A blanket and a little teddy. We tried to give you a little warmth to cling on to. Why? Why? Why could you only be with us for such a short time? Why will we never watch you take your first step? Why may we never hear your first word? Why, Jaime? Why? I could hold you in my arms. You took your final breath. An end to your pain, the beginning of our sorrow, darkness and loneliness. I would have given my life for you. I would have shouldered your pain. Soulless and still in our arms, your final moment is burned into our hearts that you were, even if it was far too short, has become a part of who we are. Jaime, my love. As long as we live, you will be with us. You are no more, and yet you will always live in our heart. That's why, Jaime, that's why you came. Love knows no time. You could be with us. You are our daughter forever. That's why, Jaime. That's why. 2 years later, it happened again, but the story of Elia Maria is one for another day. Otherwise, I will go off the time too much. Well, anyway, I hope enjoy is maybe not the right word, but it shows you something or told a little bit about my life and my experience with life and death and mortality and love. So it's a different way of doing Heidegger than you can do in an academic setting. Yeah. But it's still something I like to do. So it's kind of worthwhile to do this every now and then. Sometimes I do this paper. The last part is the true story I told at her grave. So, and from there, I made some kind of philosophical introduction, if you want. It's always a bit emotional to read the text. It brings back a lot of memories. A present in an absence. There's a lot in it. The way you experience time, etc. It's just very different in some of these cases, which has nothing to do with the now and calculating time. But anyway, thanks to all of you who've been here. It's much appreciated. If you want, you can get the text as well. There are a few typos in it still that I will need to fix, but I can do that in the coming days. I think most of you know my email, or you can send it on Facebook, and I might put it up on somewhere. I don't know yet. Maybe on the Patreon site or later on the website as well. So I'll let you know when we'll do the next one. I think I'm doing another one in December. If you're interested, try to think of another small text. So we have, I like this ending to the questions and answers. So thanks again for spending the 2 hours with me, and I hope it brought you something, and hope to see you again. And if you like spread the word. So have a nice weekend, everybody. I'll be seeing some of you next week again, and we'll meet again and talk again. So take care. I'm going to end the stream, so don't be scared when the screen goes all of a sudden. Bye bye.